So you know that I did quite a bit of DNA testing through the Genographic Project, and then I went on Family Tree DNA, and I did a 111 point marker DNA test where I found out that I actually show my Jewish and Semitic DNA as well as my Bedouin DNA, which descends from the Prophet Muhammad. What was interesting to me and what I found a little bit disheartening was that none of my Native American DNA showed up, and I actually have a quite large amount of substantiation for that concept that I actually am Native American. So I had watched a video earlier this year that was put out, and it's on YouTube, and it has been on Discovery Channel and different channels like that. And it was dealing with black Americans who claim to have Native American DNA. And it shows Tina Turner on there and Chris Rock and a couple of other people. Well, you know, when they do their DNA testing, it turns out that they don't show any Native American DNA. And I wanted to explain why that is, because I did research more into it, because I know that I'm substantially Native American and it didn't show up. I wanted to find out why. And that's what this video is about, why your Native American DNA doesn't show up. Okay, this is an article by Roberta Estes. It gives her webpage, and then Roberta at DNAexplained.com, and then what her article is autosomal DNA testing. It says successfully using autosomal DNA testing in conjunction with mitochondrial and Y-line testing to address genealogical questions. Well, what the majority of this article is talking about having Native American DNA and it not showing up at all, and she explains why. And if you read this article, you know, you can refer to either of these web pages to find this article. It's a very, very interesting article, but I'll talk to you about that in just a little bit. And here's what she says. She says, in American history, unfortunately, the records pertaining to Native Americans, and sometimes African Americans as well, are non-existent, disguised or buried in some obscure record. In the case of Native Americans, those who are reservation Indians were taxed, and therefore we have absolutely no record of their existence. There were no individual land records since the reservation was held as a tribe, and those who moved off the reservation were often exceedingly poor, very marginalized, and practiced subsistence living either wholly or in part. Many did not adopt European last names until they had no choice. Free people of color who are identified as being Indian, African, or mulatto, which meant any admixture of Indian, European, African, and Indian African, were prevented from voting, testifying in court, or attending white schools. They owned land much less often than their counterparts of European descent. Most often those people were sharecroppers, often less fortunate than slaves, who were at least provided with food and shelter. They were desperately poor, hungry, and barely surviving. Poor white sharecroppers often worked side by side with these free people of color, both attempting to scratch out a living from their marginalized circumstances. Without tax, deed, or court records, the genealogist often reaches a dead end. Unfortunately, money was required for all of these transactions, including obtaining a marriage license, which probably explains many missing records. We find court records in North Carolina General Assembly sessions where the desperately poor weren't being taxed because they had nothing but the tax. The tax collectors were instructed to collect poll taxes for them for the land owners on which they lived. Many probably lost their homes because of this legislation. Enslaved Africans, Indians, and many Europeans who were brought as indentured servants lived and worked together. Most indentured servants served 7 years, some more and a few less. Masters tended to work indentured servants harder, with less rest, and more brutally than their slaves that they owned. They knew that they had the indentured servants. They would only have the benefit of 7 years' labor, and they intended to get every hour and every day from them. Many died. During this time of the Europeans' indenture, they often lived and worked enslaved population on the plantation. Nature taking its course, these populations, African, Indian, European, established relationships, had children. Eventually laws were enacted preventing whites from intermarrying with people of color, free or bond, but that didn't stop nature from taking its course. Owners of slaves who were bond for life tended to treat them with somewhat more humanely than indentured servants, if the circumstances under which slaves lived can be described in any manner at all, because they had a financial investment in their continued health. A sick or dead slave was worth nothing, or worse, was a liability. So what happens with this is I have a Native American ancestor whose name is Rebecca McKinney, and she married another Native American who was free and didn't go to the reservation, and his last name was George. And I can see in records that George came over as a pioneer to the West, and then he met Rebecca McKinney, who shows up in a role as a child, a teenager, and a young woman on a reservation, and she married him and moved off the reservation. And that is my grandmother, Susie George's parents. So Susie George never claimed openly that she was Native American. In fact, I was asking a aunt of mine. I talked to two aunts this weekend, and I was talking to her about that. Why Grandma, my white grandmother, who was married to my grandfather, who also looked white but was Native American, never would admit that Grandma George, was actually Native American. And in fact, Grandma would always say they were nice people. That's how she answered the Native American question. But Grandpa would always say, I'm Cherokee. And in fact, Grandpa is Cherokee through not only his George family, but then his grandfather, who is Susie's husband, was Sherman. And then Susie was the George, and her mother was on the reservation. Her mother was Rebecca McKinney. Married Sherman. Sherman's mother, whose name is Faraba Wellman, and her mother's name was Thompson. Actually, no, Jones, I'm sorry. Sure, her last name was Jones, and they were from Kentucky, was actually Cherokee Indian too. And I'll slip in some pictures here to show you pictures of both of them. Susie does not look so Native American. She looks a little bit more Irish, but it's a black and white photo, so it's hard to tell. Faraba has a very white name and very white clothing and everything, and she's married to an Irishman who came across, as from the East on the coast and became a pioneer, and they married, and she looks Native American but has very white dress, but then she's got a Native American type necklace on, and I always thought it was because she was good friends with Susie, who was her daughter-in-law, but in fact they both were Cherokee from the same tribe, from the Puma tribe. Anyway, that's on my mom's side. On my dad's side, there is a book that was written, and it's out of print, and I so wanted to get this book because my uncle has it, but it's called Telfair County, Georgia, History 1807 to 1987, and in this book, Telfair County, Georgia, History 1807 to 1987, it lists a census, and in that census, it has one of my grandmothers in between this period of time, and I would have to actually get the book, which is down in Cochran, Georgia, where my family is from, which is near Telfair County. It has listed as my grandmother listed not by her white name, but as Indian Woman Cheeks. So she's there. Then I also have my dad's mother. That was on my dad's father's side. But on my dad's mother's side, there's a Native American ancestor, and this is kind of rumored in the family, but it's probably true, that was adopted by a family somewhere in the 1800s. And then he married his cousin, who was... he was raised with, but not biologically related to, and they had children. I'm descended from them through the Sanders line. Anyway, long story short, there are those stories. They're true stories. I have substantiation for 2 of the 4 stories, and yet it doesn't show up in my DNA. Now, why does that happen? If you read this article right here, it does explain it very well, and I noticed this when I did my DNA testing. In my DNA testing, I am R1B1, and I'm a derivative of that. It's R1BA something, which is typically a Pictish Scottish lineage. Well, I'm very much more mixed than that, and I know that because I have such good genealogical records, but I do know that a large portion of my family is Welsh, Irish, and Scottish, which would have originally probably been the first migrants to Britain back during the Ice Age, right? But all of those ancestors, the R1B1 class, I think they said makes up 40% of the European population, all have a DNA marker that goes back to Siberia. And the DNA marker in Siberia is where all Native Americans split off. And they say about 30 people, possibly that few people, came over to America. And every Native American, Cherokee, Sioux, whatever you are, and South American, Aztec, Incan, Mayan, all originated from that original strain of people. So when you test your DNA, if you're on a reservation, for instance, and your admixture is not too much, what happens is you show a distinctive Native American DNA marker. But in this article, she addresses all the DNA testing that she's done, and she says that it's in fact very hard to prove that you have Native American DNA, much less to prove, you can't even prove what tribe you're from. You can prove that you're Native American, right? Because if you don't have enough mutation, you will actually show that stoppage of the mutation that happens with that 30 group of people, which is like it's a founder's DNA marker, where you have a small group of people that come to an area and then nobody else mixes in with them for a long period of time, and they have a very distinctive marker. I would say people in Iceland probably typically have this because everybody in Iceland is ultimately intermingled with each other and married to each other, and they don't have a huge population of other people coming in and living there. So everybody has a certain DNA marker, and it would be very easy to tell, that you're directly from Iceland because your markers would be so distinct. But what she says is, she says that actually the most common DNA marker in Native Americans today, even on the reservations, is R1B1. Now, why is that? It's because Native Americans were intermarrying before they were removed. And when you have intermarriage, you adopt DNA from your mother's mother and from your father's father. So if you don't happen to have a mother and a father that are directly Indian, you know what I'm saying? Like a white man marries an Indian woman, and then that child marries someone who had a white mother, and then that woman becomes your mother. Then your mother's DNA is going to be white, and your father's DNA is going to be white, even though you have lots of Indian in there, generations back. So what she's saying is that that's the most common DNA strand. So it's very frustrating to try to prove that you're Native American. I found it frustrating for me because I was like, where is it? I know that I'm Islamic, and I know, well, Islamic, if you want to call it that, Bedouin, and I know that I'm Semitic, because I can see that I'm also Chinese. That doesn't show up anywhere because, once again, that's that same DNA marker that became Native American that just gets absorbed into the R1B1, and then it disguises itself. So what I'm saying to you is, even though DNA seems to be very reliable, and it is, we still don't have enough people contributing their DNA that can prove their genealogy to be able to create this pool that shows how to mark people that are mixed. So what I'm getting on Family Tree of DNA, and it's very, very interesting, is I'm finding people that are saying, like, how are we related to each other? And I'm like, there are a couple of possible ways we could be related to each other. You could be a Plantagenet. You could be descended from royalty anywhere in Europe, and you would have very similar markers to me. You could be Native American, and that would be very, very hard to prove. But if we're not finding any other connection whatsoever, and you have Native American DNA, and in fact, I found a woman online that's what it was. She was Cherokee, and I was Cherokee, and I can't prove that we're related exactly to the same person, but we're from the same basic group of Native Americans, and that would be our only connection. I mean, we went through family names and everything else, and it's like nothing matches, can't find anything that matches at all. And but we're both Native American, but we would not either pass as Native American right now, So when you're going through this, you'll find that all these people are actually like related to you, and you'll actually show relation like second or third cousins a lot of times. The other thing that's interesting is what I'm realizing is because of the Plantagenet line, what happens is when you have common ancestors who marry common ancestors, like in royal lines, you reduce the number of ancestors that you had. So while you may be many, many, many generations separated from each other, I'm finding people that are in Europe that have no possible way of being my second cousin are showing up as my second cousins. And that's physically impossible. I mean, I did have uncles, that were in World War II. Possible, but not probable at the number that I'm finding. So what's happening is because we all have such common ancestors, it's shortening the apparent distance between generations. And I would imagine that that's probably a case with genetics too. So those are my interesting discoveries right now. But yeah, I would love for you to read this article. It's fascinating how she tacks it down. She's one of the authorities on Native American DNA. And once again, I'm going to read the last part of her statement that she makes in this article, and it says, this sometimes becomes confusing because the single most common male haplogroup among Cherokee tribal members who have tested is R1b, which is my DNA. How can this be, you ask? Clearly, one of three possibilities exist. The Cherokee, or those tribes who were assimilated into the Cherokee, adopted a male into the tribe, or a European male fathered a child that was subsequently raised as Cherokee. Now, these are people that are on reservations, not people like me that are many generations down living as white people and who obviously have this DNA. The R1b ancestor was not adopted into the tribe, maintained their European American identity, but married a Cherokee individual, which also happened in my family. Because I have lots of Cherokee mothers who were, had white names and passed in society, show on records. Some of them I have pictures of. I'll try to show you these pictures at the end. It'd be kind of interesting. This might be the case where one of 8 grandparents is our example, was European white, and the other 7 were not. See? Now that's on a reservation. In my case, it would be the opposite, where I would have like 2 out of a mix of maybe 16 that have Native American DNA, and then maybe 4 a branch up out of 32. So the same ratio. There is some level of R1b admixture in the native population that preceded contacts with European that we have not yet identified. Now, that's entirely possible because where did R1b1 come from? All people with R1b have the marker that became the Native American marker. So why is it so impossible to believe that Native Americans would also have an R1b marker? Because essentially back as the Ice Age was melting off, when we were hunting, reindeer in Siberia and mammoth and woolly rhinoceros and stuff, we were the same people. And then we gradually went west and became Europeans. And then ultimately my other genetic group became blonde, blue-eyed white people through some interesting, genetic mutation. We derived that, incredible, interesting, different gene. But anyway, that's some interesting stuff there. So what I want to say to you is black, white, whatever you may be, if someone in your family has said that they're Native American and you're not seeing it in your DNA, wait a couple of years. And you may actually be able to substantiate that story. Because I can substantiate my story, but I can't prove it in my DNA. How frustrating is that? I also wanted to show this to you. This is Roberta Estes' DNA certificate. Everybody gets this when you do family tree DNA if you want to, pull it up. But what's interesting, she's haplogroup J. Okay? But then we're going to page down, and she's going to show you how many ancestors are only showing through that. Now, this is a group that shows, if you look at it for a second, it comes down to a brother and sister, right? Now, her brother did his DNA test, apparently, and they're showing all the way up through father, grandfather, blah, blah, blah. Mother shows through the other side. But notice that these are all the ancestors that encompass each generation. But you're only showing your DNA in these particular type of tests through one person to one person. So all of these people are omitted. And that's where those vague lines of DNA testing are showing up all my cousins that we can't really figure out how we're related to each other. But yet we show up very close cousins in our DNA, and our DNA matches. Now, this is her example, not mine, but mine looks just like this. So please read this article. I think it would be very enlightening for you. To me, it was just like it substantiated what I already had assumed to be the case, because I'm pretty good at doing math like that. I'm kind of smart. I'm not a dumb blonde. So these are some pictures of my ancestors that are Native American. They were from Kentucky. This is Elizabeth Jones. She's the mother of Faribault Wellman, who is my great-great-grandmother. And then I'm going to come down here. And this is Faribault. And she looks obviously Native American. I found out talking to my aunts that what I suspected was that she was Cherokee, and they told me that she was in fact Cherokee. They had come from Kentucky and that she was mixed in, and her father was probably white, maybe, but they were passing in general white society. This is a picture of Susie George, whose mother was Rebecca McKinney, who was on the reservation in Missouri, which is where they were from, and then they moved into Iowa. She married Sherman, who you see over on the right, a very nice, attractive looking, white man. But he was half Indian, because his mother was Faraba. And you can see that in his bone structure. And this is just a great picture of one of my cousins. She actually was one of my aunts. Her name was Maima Parker. And she married one of her cousins, who was a George, from Milan, Missouri, which is where Sissy came from. And Susie's the woman in the other picture. So she's not one of my direct ancestors, but I have cousins through her. But she and her sisters all write letters in this book, which is my family history, that are in here, that talk about how they want to have blonde hair, blue-eyed babies because they all had dark hair and dark eyes. Okay, the one on the right, I'll scoot up on him a little bit. That's James Asa Parker. He is my great-great-grandfather. He's Faraba, the Indian woman from Kentucky's husband. As you can see, he's very Irish. His father owned a mill and owned slaves. Not many people in my family owned slaves because on my dad's side, they were all, originally they became Quakers, so they didn't. But on my mother's side, he owned slaves, and then they became pioneers, so nobody after that owned slaves. But he didn't personally own slaves. His father did. And then on the left is his brother, whose name was Noah Parker. And I just found out, I had always heard in this book, which is my family history, I'll show you the front of it. It's just bound in plastic. It's old, rattered. It's paperback. One of my great aunts did it on my mom's side. It has a picture of him, and the story in here is that he wandered off one day and they thought the Indians had gotten him, right? Well, I'm talking to one of my aunts on Thanksgiving, and it turns out that the story that she told me was that he rode off on horseback and they never saw him again, so they assumed the Indians got him. What really happened to this guy is he moved to Texas, and there are Parkers in Texas who are related through him. So you could be a Parker in Texas and be related to me through my great-great-grandfather through his brother. But nobody in this family ever heard from him again, and now through modern, usage of like the internet and Facebook and DNA testing, I'm starting to find people that are related to me through this man right here, who we always thought had died, when in fact he did not. There you have it. Good looking people. So I wanted to thank you for watching my video. I hope that this has been helpful to you. I have the fortune of having really good family histories, and I'm finding most of the thing in those histories to be actually very helpful and well documented. If you can get a hold of those things, that'd be fantastic. But yeah, I have enjoyed the whole DNA genetic experience. I'm finding some of it to be a little bit misleading, but now that I'm beginning to understand why, I'm trying to share that with you. And if you have any questions, feel free, to comment underneath this video or any of the other videos related to this. I'd be glad to try to point you in a direction or give you any advice that I've garnered, from this journey. And thanks for watching. Appreciate it. Okay, dude. What are you doing? Come on. You're so crazy.